4 minutes and 20 seconds. That's the time it took for Iran's latest hypersonic weapon, the Fattah-2, to travel from its launch site outside Tehran to a military installation deep inside Israeli territory. Not 10 minutes. Not 15. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. From the moment the rocket engines ignited to the moment the warhead detonated on its target. From launch detection to confirmed impact. From warning initiated to destruction completed. And here's the number that keeps Israeli defense officials awake at night, the number that fundamentally changes everything about how this conflict can be fought. Israel's comprehensive missile alert system requires approximately 6 minutes to complete its full warning sequence. The system needs to detect the launch using satellite infrared sensors. It needs to track the missile using ground-based and naval radar systems. It needs to calculate the precise trajectory. It needs to determine which population centers fall within the projected impact zone. It needs to transmit alerts through multiple communication channels. It needs to activate sirens across the affected regions. It needs to give civilians time to hear those sirens, understand what they mean, and physically move to protected shelters. 6 minutes. That's the minimum timeline for this multi-step process to work as designed. The Fattah-2 completes its entire flight in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The missile impacts 1 minute and 40 seconds before the warning system can finish telling people to take cover. The weapon arrives before the protection can activate. The destruction happens before the defense can respond. The explosion occurs before civilians can reach safety. This is not a marginal timing problem that can be solved with faster computers or better communication networks. This is a fundamental inversion of everything missile defense was designed to achieve. The Fattah-2 represents Iran's second-generation hypersonic glide vehicle, building directly on the Fattah-1 platform unveiled the previous year. The original variant achieved speeds around Mach 13 with an operational range of 1,400 kilometers. The upgraded version maintains that range while pushing velocity to Mach 15, approximately 11,500 miles per hour. At that speed, the missile covers 3.1 miles every single second. The distance from Tehran to Tel Aviv measures roughly 990 miles. The mathematics are straightforward and terrifying. At 3.1 miles per second, 990 miles requires exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds of flight time. And there exists no defensive system currently deployed anywhere in the world, not in Israel, not in the United States, not in Europe, not anywhere, that can reliably intercept a target moving at Mach 15 while simultaneously executing evasive maneuvers during its terminal approach phase. The combination of extreme velocity and active maneuvering creates an interception problem that current technology cannot solve. The physics of missile defense depend entirely on prediction. Every interception system ever built operates on the same fundamental principle. Radar detects an incoming threat. Computers calculate where that threat will be at a specific future moment based on its current position, velocity, and trajectory. An interceptor launches toward that predicted location. The interceptor and the incoming missile arrive at the same point in space at the same moment in time. They collide. The threat is destroyed. This system works remarkably well against missiles that follow predictable ballistic arcs. A conventional ballistic missile launches, climbs to peak altitude, and then falls back toward Earth in a trajectory determined entirely by physics and initial launch conditions. That trajectory can be calculated with extreme precision. An interceptor can be sent to the exact point where the missile will be in 30 seconds or 60 seconds or 90 seconds. The mathematics are complex but solvable. The interception is achievable. The Fattah-2 does not follow a predictable ballistic arc. After its initial boost phase, the missile separates from its rocket booster and transitions into a fundamentally different flight mode. The warhead becomes a hypersonic glide vehicle, using aerodynamic control surfaces to actively manage its descent path. It doesn't fall. It flies. And as it flies, it adjusts. Not major course corrections. Small continuous modifications. 5 degrees left. 3 degrees right. 2 degrees downward. 7 degrees lateral. Each adjustment is minor in isolation. But each adjustment means the missile is no longer positioned where defensive systems predicted it would be. When you're attempting to intercept a target moving at Mach 15, small prediction errors translate into enormous missed distances. Being wrong about the target's position by 3 degrees at those velocities means your interceptor misses by miles, not meters. The intercept solution that was valid 2 seconds ago is worthless now because the target has moved somewhere else. And by the time you recalculate and adjust, the target has moved again. The interceptor is always chasing a position the missile has already left. This is why the Fattah-2's maneuvering capability matters even more than its raw speed. A non-maneuvering hypersonic missile would still be extremely difficult to intercept, but the problem would at least be mathematically solvable. A maneuvering hypersonic missile creates an interception challenge that cannot be solved with current technology regardless of how fast your interceptors are or how powerful your radars are. The defensive geometry simply does not work. Israel operates one of the most sophisticated layered missile defense architectures ever constructed. The system was designed to engage threats at multiple altitudes and multiple ranges, ensuring that incoming missiles face multiple intercept opportunities before reaching their targets. The Arrow 3 system represents the outermost layer, designed to engage ballistic missiles during their mid-course phase at altitudes exceeding 100 kilometers. At those extreme altitudes, outside the atmosphere, interceptors can maneuver freely without aerodynamic constraints. The Arrow 3 was specifically built to destroy Iranian ballistic missiles during the portion of their flight when they're highest above the Earth and most vulnerable to interception. The Fattah-2 defeats the Arrow 3 by never entering its engagement envelope. The hypersonic glide vehicle operates at altitudes below 50 kilometers for most of its flight, staying within the atmosphere where it can use aerodynamic controls to maneuver. Arrow 3 interceptors are not optimized for engagement at those altitudes. The system was designed for a different kind of threat, one that climbs high into space before falling back down. The Fattah-2 stays low. Arrow 3 cannot effectively reach it. David Sling represents the middle layer of Israeli missile defense, designed to engage medium-range threats at lower altitudes than Arrow 3. The system can theoretically operate in the altitude band where the Fattah-2 flies. But David Sling interceptors were optimized for targets moving between Mach 5 and Mach 8. The Fattah-2 travels at Mach 15. The closing speed between interceptor and target is wrong. The geometry of the intercept approach doesn't work. The interceptor cannot adjust its course fast enough to compensate for the target's velocity and maneuvers. David Sling was built for a threat that moves half as fast as what it now faces. Iron Dome represents the innermost layer, designed to intercept short-range rockets and small unmanned aerial systems. The system has achieved remarkable success against Palestinian rocket attacks, with intercept rates consistently exceeding 90% against those specific threats. But Iron Dome was never designed to engage hypersonic missiles. The system's interceptors, radars, and fire control computers are optimized for threats moving at a tiny fraction of hypersonic velocities. Attempting to use Iron Dome against the Fattah-2 would be like trying to stop a bullet with a butterfly net. The tool is simply wrong for the task. The result is a missile that passes through all three layers of Israeli missile defense without any of them achieving a reliable intercept solution. Not because Israeli technology is inferior or Israeli operators are incompetent. Because the threat was designed specifically to exploit the gaps between what defensive systems can do and what the attack requires them to do. Israel's Home Front Command operates what is generally considered the most sophisticated civilian alert system on the planet. The system integrates satellite detection, radar tracking, computer analysis, and multi-channel communication to warn civilian populations of incoming threats with enough time to reach protective shelter. The system was designed around specific threat timelines. For rockets launched from Gaza, the warning window ranges from 15 to 90 seconds depending on launch location and target area. For missiles launched from Lebanon, warning time extends to between 1 and 5 minutes. For ballistic missiles launched from Iran following traditional trajectories, the system was calibrated to provide 10 to 15 minutes of warning. That extended warning time allowed for comprehensive response protocols. Sirens could be activated across large geographic areas. Alert messages could be transmitted through cellular networks, television broadcasts, and radio stations simultaneously. Civilians could process the warning, move toward designated shelters, and reach protected positions before impact. The entire civil defense architecture was built on the assumption that warning time exists. Shelter locations were designated based on how far the average person could travel in the available warning window. Siren systems were positioned to ensure audio coverage across populated areas. Public education campaigns trained civilians to respond immediately when alerts sounded, confident that immediate response would provide adequate time to reach safety. The Fattah-2 destroys every assumption the system was built upon. When the missile arrives in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and the warning system requires 6 minutes to complete its full cycle, the warning becomes meaningless. The alert transforms from a life-saving notification of approaching danger into a post-impact announcement of destruction that has already occurred. The siren sounds after the explosion. The shelter message arrives after the building has collapsed. The warning tells survivors what killed the people who didn't survive. Let me walk through the actual timeline of a Fattah-2 attack to illustrate exactly why no defensive response can succeed. Understanding the sequence makes clear that this is not a problem that can be solved with incremental improvements to existing systems. At the moment of launch, Designated as Time Zero, the missile ignites from a mobile transporter erector launcher somewhere in central Iran. The target coordinates have already been programmed into the onboard guidance system. The rocket motor produces massive thrust, accelerating the weapon vertically through the lower atmosphere. Israeli and American satellite systems detect the infrared signature of the rocket exhaust within 3 seconds of ignition. The distinctive heat bloom is unmistakable. The detection data transmits instantly to Israeli Air Defense Command and to American monitoring stations throughout the region. Ground-based radar systems in Israel and shipborne radar systems aboard American naval vessels in the eastern Mediterranean begin tracking the ascending missile. All detection activities complete within the first 10 seconds. By the 1-minute mark, the missile has climbed to approximately 40 kilometers altitude and continues accelerating. Velocity approaches Mach 10 and continues increasing. Israeli defense computers have analyzed the trajectory and determined that the missile is headed toward Israeli airspace. This is not a test launch into the desert. This is not a missile aimed at a neighboring country. This is an attack on Israel. Decision protocols activate throughout the defense establishment. Arrow 3 batteries transition to ready status. Operators prepare for potential intercept authorization. But the missile is still accelerating, still climbing, and the optimal engagement window for Arrow 3 is rapidly closing. The system needs the target to reach higher altitude for ideal intercept geometry. The Fattah-2 is not cooperating with that requirement. At the 2-minute mark, the missile reaches its peak altitude of approximately 50 kilometers and separates from its expended booster stage. The hypersonic glide vehicle, now freed from the rocket motor that lifted it to altitude, begins its descent toward Israel. Velocity has reached Mach 15 and will be maintained throughout the glide phase. Israeli air defense commanders make their decision. Launch Arrow 3 interceptors. 2 missiles fire from separate batteries, accelerating toward a calculated intercept point in the upper atmosphere. Flight time to the intercept zone is approximately 90 seconds. The Fattah-2 will enter Israeli airspace in approximately 120 seconds. The mathematics suggest interception is theoretically possible if everything goes perfectly. At the 3-minute mark, the Fattah-2 begins executing its programmed maneuvers. The control surfaces adjust the glide path with small but continuous corrections. The missile is no longer following the trajectory that Israeli computers predicted based on its initial descent angle. The Arrow 3 interceptors are traveling toward an intercept point that was calculated before the maneuvers began. The target will not be at that point when the interceptors arrive. Israeli radar tracks the maneuvers in real time. Computers update the intercept calculations continuously. The new calculations show that the interceptors will miss. There is no time to launch additional interceptors. The geometry cannot be corrected. The Fattah-2 is now 45 seconds from impact. At the 4-minute mark, Home Front Command activates sirens in the calculated impact zone. The Fattah-2 is descending through 15 kilometers altitude at Mach 15, still maneuvering through its terminal approach phase. The warhead's guidance system is making final corrections to ensure precise impact on the designated target. Civilians in Tel Aviv hear the sirens and begin moving toward shelters. The movement has barely started when the missile strikes its target, a military command facility in central Israel. The explosion occurs 20 seconds after the sirens began sounding. Civilians who were moving toward shelter when the detonation occurred are still in the open. They never had a chance to reach protected positions. The warning time was 20 seconds. The minimum time required to reach shelter from most locations in the city is 90 seconds. The attack is complete. 4 minutes and 20 seconds from launch to impact. Detection happened. Tracking happened. Intercept attempts happened. Warnings happened. None of it mattered because the missile moved too fast and maneuvered too effectively for any defensive response to succeed. The timeline was compressed beyond what the defensive systems could accommodate. The warning was too short. The intercept geometry was impossible. The civil defense framework failed completely. For 15 years, Israeli civilians have lived with the understanding that their missile defense systems work. Not perfectly, not every single time, but reliably enough that the threat from rockets and missiles could be managed. Iron Dome intercepts 90% of rockets launched from Gaza. Arrow and David's Sling engage longer-range threats with reasonable success rates. The civilian population has been taught to trust that when sirens sound, they have time to reach shelter, and the defensive systems have a good chance of intercepting threats before impact. This trust enables normal life in a country under constant threat. People go to work. Children attend school. Businesses operate. Families make long-term plans. The psychological foundation for all of this activity is the belief that defensive systems and warning protocols provide meaningful protection most of the time. The Fattah-2 does not erode that trust gradually over time. It destroys the trust instantly and completely. Once the population understands that warning time no longer exists for certain categories of attack, the entire civil defense framework stops functioning as intended. Shelters become psychological comfort rather than actual protection if you cannot reach them before impact. Alert systems become notification networks for attacks that have already occurred rather than warning systems for attacks that are approaching. Defensive interceptors become expensive demonstrations of technological capability that cannot actually stop the threats they were designed to defeat. The psychological destabilization caused by this realization exceeds the physical damage from any individual missile strike. Israeli society has endured decades of rocket attacks and terrorist incidents by maintaining collective confidence that defensive measures and warning systems provide reasonable protection for civilians who follow proper protocols. When people understand that they could die before the warning even sounds, when they recognize that shelters are unreachable in the available time window, when they accept that defensive interceptors cannot stop the incoming threat, the psychological calculus of living in Israel fundamentally changes. You cannot build a functioning society where millions of people work, raise families, and pursue normal lives while genuinely believing that death can arrive in 4 minutes with no effective warning and no meaningful defense. Human beings cannot sustain normal psychological functioning under that level of uncontrollable existential threat. Something has to change. Either the threat has to be eliminated, or the population has to leave, or people have to maintain psychological denial that the threat is real. Israeli government statements following the demonstration carefully avoided acknowledging the implications. No mention that the warning system failed to provide adequate protection time. No mention that Arrow 3 interceptors failed to achieve intercept. No mention that if Iran had targeted a civilian population center rather than a military facility, hundreds of people would have died before anyone reached shelter. Those facts are too destabilizing for public acknowledgement. But everyone in the Israeli defense establishment understands them. And everyone is asking the same fundamental question. What happens when the next Fattah-2 launches? The 4-minute flight time does not only break civilian defense. It breaks military response doctrine as well. Israeli strategic planning for responding to Iranian missile threats has always assumed that early warning provides sufficient time to launch retaliatory strikes before incoming Iranian missiles reach their targets. The concept is straightforward. Iran launches missiles at Israel. Israeli warning systems detect the launch and predict the impact timeline. Israeli commanders authorize retaliatory strikes. Israeli aircraft become airborne and begin flying toward Iranian targets before the incoming missiles have completed their flight. Iran watches Israeli retaliation beginning while its own attack is still in progress. This creates powerful deterrence. Iranian leadership knows that launching missiles triggers immediate Israeli retaliation. The retaliation is already underway before the Iranian missiles even hit their targets. Any Iranian attack guarantees an Israeli counterattack that cannot be prevented. 4-minute flight time eliminates this response cycle. By the time Israeli commanders receive confirmed detection of a launch, analyze the threat characteristics, authenticate the launch decision, authorize retaliatory strikes, and get aircraft airborne, the incoming missile has already impacted its target. The retaliation happens after the damage is complete rather than before. This changes the deterrence calculation significantly in Iran's favor. Iranian leadership no longer needs to worry that launching missiles triggers retaliation that arrives while their attack is still in progress. They can launch, wait for impact, assess the damage they've caused, and then prepare for Israeli retaliation from a more favorable position. The operational timeline has shifted. Iran benefits from the compression of the attack cycle. 4-minute window also compresses decision-making in ways that dramatically increase the risk of catastrophic miscalculation on both sides. When Israeli radar detects a Mach 15 object launched from Iran and traveling toward Israeli airspace, commanders have 4 minutes to make decisions that could determine whether millions of people live or die. 4 minutes to determine whether the incoming warhead carries conventional explosives or nuclear material. 4 minutes to decide whether this represents a limited strike against a specific military target or the opening wave of a total war scenario. 4 minutes to decide whether the appropriate response is proportional conventional retaliation or escalation to weapons of mass destruction. These are decisions that should never be made under extreme time pressure. The consequences of getting them wrong are measured in human lives, potentially in the hundreds of thousands or millions. But the Fattah-2 forces exactly this scenario. The compressed timeline leaves no room for careful deliberation, no opportunity to gather additional intelligence, no chance to communicate with adversaries and potentially de-escalate before responding. Decisions must be made immediately based on incomplete information with catastrophic consequences for errors. Iran's demonstration that hypersonic missiles can strike targets in 4 minutes with no effective defense carries implications far beyond the Middle East. This is a message for every nation that relies on missile defense systems and early warning networks to protect civilian populations and military assets. The United States operates similar layered defense architectures. South Korea maintains extensive civil defense infrastructure. Taiwan has invested heavily in warning systems and shelter networks. Japan operates sophisticated radar and interceptor systems. All of these nations built their defenses on the same assumptions that just failed in Israel. Warning time exists. Intercept systems can engage hypersonic threats. Civilian populations can reach shelter before impact. Defensive responses can occur within available timelines. China is developing hypersonic weapons with capabilities equal to or exceeding the Fattah-2. Russian forces already operate hypersonic missiles that have been used in combat operations. North Korea is actively working on hypersonic technology. The proliferation of these weapons means that the scenario Iran just demonstrated in the Middle East will be replicable in the Pacific, in Europe, and anywhere else that adversaries develop or acquire hypersonic delivery systems. The comfortable assumption that air defense and missile defense provide meaningful protection against modern threats is dying in real time. The systems that nations have spent hundreds of billions of dollars developing and deploying over the past several decades were built for a threat environment that no longer exists. Those systems work against conventional ballistic missiles. They work against cruise missiles. They work against aircraft. They do not work against maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicles traveling at Mach 15. And no nation currently possesses a replacement system that solves this problem. Research programs are underway. Prototype systems are in development. Directed energy weapons and advanced kinetic interceptors show theoretical promise. But none of these solutions are deployed. None of them are operational. None of them are protecting civilian populations today. The gap between the threat that exists and the defense that exists is measured in years of development time that hasn't happened yet. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. That's faster than the alert system can complete its warning cycle. Faster than interceptors can reach their calculated engagement points. Faster than human decision makers can process information and authorize responses. Faster than civilians can travel from their daily activities to protected shelter locations. The Fattah-2 does not merely strike its designated target. It strikes the entire framework of assumptions that made living under missile threats psychologically survivable for civilian populations. It strikes the deterrence calculations that prevented adversaries from launching attacks. It strikes the military response doctrines that promised retaliation would begin before attacks concluded. There is no defensive counter that restores the protection that has been lost. No technological advancement that returns the warning time that no longer exists. No operational adjustment that makes the intercept geometry work against maneuvering hypersonic threats. The missile has been demonstrated. The capability has been proven. The implications cannot be undone. The weapon is in the air. The impact is approaching. And the alert sounds after the explosion has already claimed its victims.